Welcome to the Strong AF podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Natasha Barnes. I'm a strength and rehab coach for climbers, and I blend my 24 years of expertise and experience as an elite level climber, competitive powerlifter, and rehab professional to bring you a podcast that will help you become stronger and more resilient. In this podcast, we'll talk about all things strength training for climbers. We'll also talk about climbing injuries, rehab, and why training and rehab go hand in hand. To connect, be sure to follow me over on Instagram at Natasha Barnes. To find out more about coaching or getting help with an injury, check out my website at natashabarnesrehab.com. And now, let's get to the episode. Welcome again to the Strong AF podcast and the very first episode. I'm Dr. Natasha Barnes. I'm a strength and rehab coach for climbers. This podcast is an extension of my online business, and in this episode, I'm going to be introducing the podcast. So just a little bit about me for those of you who might not know my background. I've been climbing since 1999. That is 24 years. I'm a former bouldering national champion, a V11/13D climber, and I'm also a competitive powerlifter with an elite level total and several state powerlifting records. I started my career in business because I myself struggled with climbing injuries that forced me to stop climbing. At the time, there was pretty much no medical experts who knew about climbing injuries, and I was told to just stop climbing. As someone who made their living climbing and had an identity wrapped around it, that was not an answer. So I went to school to learn about sports medicine so that I could help myself and other climbers recover and get back to climbing. We can get into my story in another episode, or you can listen to other podcasts I've been on where I talk about that specifically. I'll put them in the show notes here, but anyway, I've been helping climbers overcome injuries for the last 11 years. That's how long I've had my business. I want to talk a little bit about my why for this podcast. So the reason I am starting the Strong AF podcast is because I want to bring you long form content on the things I'm always talking about on Instagram and with my clients. Obviously, mainly focused on strength training and rehab for climbers. I also want to address frequently asked questions I get from my clients and from followers on Instagram. And a podcast just seemed like a great way to do that. I've been on several podcasts talking about my story, my business, strength training, injuries, and rehab for climbers. So I feel pretty comfortable talking about these things in podcast format. I love podcasts myself, and I'm always listening to them when I'm on my walks, when I'm doing cardio, while I'm cleaning the house and doing laundry. So I figured other folks might be interested in listening to a podcast from me. I think it's a really fun and easy way to consume content and learn about the things that we're all interested in as climbers. Recently, I was interviewing my friend Tom Herbert. You guys will know him as Useful Coach on Instagram. He's a nutrition expert, and I get a lot of nutrition questions from folks on my foundational strength training program and just from people on Instagram in general. So I wanted to have him on as a resource, and we did a Q&A call that was podcast style, and I just really enjoyed talking to him, and I realized that it would be really fun and easy to record podcasts that way and have guest experts on whose opinions I really trust. It's also just a fun way to get to talk about work with my friends and colleagues because I love talking about the work that I do and the work that they do, and we basically just get to talk about climbing, strength training, and rehab all day long, which is really, really fun. And then I was talking to my best friend, who's also a business coach. Her name is Kai. If you guys follow me on Instagram, you've probably seen her. And she also really inspired me and supported me in my idea to start a podcast. And she knows me really well, and she just knew it would be a really good fit for me and my business and really encouraged me to start it. I got on a call with my friend Chelsea Mern, who's also a business coach who I've gotten help from many times now. She has her own podcast called The Ambitious Entrepreneur. I've been on her podcast before. Back then it was called the Lady Beta podcast, but now it's called The Ambitious Entrepreneur. I will link it in the show notes, but talk to her about getting some tips about starting mine, and the rest is history. And now you are listening to the actual podcast. Here it is. In case you guys can't tell, I am bursting at the seams with excitement about this podcast. So thank you for being here, and thank you for listening to the very first episode. I really want to shout out the folks that I just mentioned and anybody who's also had me on their podcast before. I want to thank the people that I just mentioned in particular for the support and guidance on getting this thing launched. And obviously wanted to thank people who've had me on their podcasts before, because those experiences are what inspired me to start this thing. So I really want to thank Ryan Devlin at the Struggle Climbing Show. That was the most recent podcast I've been on, and that was a fun experience. You can go listen to that episode. I'm going to link all of these in the show notes, but I also want to thank Stephen Dimmitt for the Nugget Climbing podcast, probably one of my favorite climbing podcasts out there. And I've been on Stephen's podcasts, I think, like 2 or 3 times. I also want to thank Chris Hampton and Nate Drolet at the Power Company podcast for having me on the podcast a while back, talking about pain science. That was a great experience. I want to thank my friend Dr. Alyssa Olenek for having me on the Messy Middle podcast. Obviously, I want to thank Chelsea Mern for having me on the Lady Beta podcast / now it's known as the Ambitious Entrepreneur podcast. I also want to thank Neely Quinn for having me on the Training Beta podcast so many years ago. I think her podcast was maybe one of the first I was ever on. I also want to thank Quinn, Jared, and John for having me on the Clinical Athlete podcast. I want to thank Ross Dempsey for having me on the Progression Health podcast. I've been on his podcast like 2 or 3 times now. I want to thank Mason and Chris for interviewing me for the Adaptabilia podcast. And of course, I want to thank Heather Campbell for having me on the You Are Made for More podcast. All of these people, thank you for having me on and giving me a platform to talk about the things that I love. It was really those experiences that sparked my interest in starting my own podcast. So thank you. And this podcast exists because of all of you. Let's talk about the release schedule. So the plan right now is to post an episode every Tuesday. That day makes the most sense for me right now for recording and editing. But who knows, maybe it'll change in the future. I'll let you guys know if it does. But Tuesday is the plan right now. If you enjoy my content and you already know you're going to love this podcast, then I encourage you to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so that you can be notified immediately when we drop a new episode. The podcast is going to be available on Spotify, iTunes, eventually YouTube, and probably everywhere else you can get a podcast. The structure of the podcast is going to be mostly solo episodes related to strength training and climbing related injuries / rehab. But I'll also be having the occasional guest expert or climber / athlete whose training philosophies align with the podcast. There's a few people who've already agreed to be on the podcast, and you'll just have to stay tuned to find out who, but I think you'll love all the folks that we have on the podcast. Going to be a mix of, like I said, guest experts and climbers and other athletes. I also want to do episodes where I do listener Q&A, so stay tuned for those because I'll be asking you guys for questions and I'll be answering them here on the podcast. They can be follow-up questions for previous episodes or just general questions that you guys have that you want me to answer. So we'll be doing those as well. So stay tuned. That's it for episode 1. This is just an introduction to the podcast, a little bit about me, what to expect from the podcast. So thank you for listening. I hope that you are just as excited for this as I am. And I hope that you listen to the other episodes that are coming out. If you love the podcast or you know you're going to love the podcast, here are some free ways to support me and the podcast. Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Tell your friends about it. Write us a 5-star review once you've listened to a couple of episodes because it really helps drive traffic to the podcast. And follow me on Instagram at Natasha Barnes. You can check out more of my free content there, including my free deadlift guide that people love. You can also check out my programs, including the Foundational Strength Training Program, through the link in my bio on there. If you need help with an injury, check out my website, natashabarnesrehab.com. And thanks again for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.